Let's bring in CTV political commentator Scott Reid with your thoughts today, Scott, on what we're seeing in the Capitol.
Well, it really truly is remarkable. We don't see many of these state funerals and an event with this much protocol and celebration and circumstance and pomp and all of that. And, it's just as you said earlier, it's an explosion of praise and people remembering the effect he had, the mark he left, the legacy that he built. And I just want to emphasize this and how remarkable this is, because I'm a political hack, Todd. That's where I come from, pure politics. And to see Joe Clark, a man who won the leadership against Brian Mulroney in 1976, who quarreled with him, for the leadership in 81 and 83, then served in his cabinet, then became a colleague of his and a compatriot. You hear the sincerity of his praise for Brian Mulroney. I mean, there's a real quality that is attested to there, that Brian Mulroney could take somebody who had been a rival and that they could work so closely together and to do so in a way where they really genuinely came to like one another and achieve so much. That relationship could have fallen into, tears and bitterness, and it did not. And that tells you something about Brian Mulroney. It tells you a great deal about Brian Mulroney.
Yeah, and also, the fact that Joe Clark, later Mulroney, leading the Progressive Conservative Party, arguably a very different kind of conservative party than we have now. But, you hear time and again about the efforts that Mulroney made on the environment, Scott, and how he was a trendsetter, really a pathfinder when it came to that sort of thing. And, just a different kind of conservative, perhaps, than people are used to in 2024.
I think that's right. But, fundamentally, he was a pragmatist, not a populist. And that's the most important thing. People can, try to, slice and dice the political spectrum and talk about, personal values and the personal qualities of our political leaders versus those of today. But he was a pragmatist. And so he wanted his party to be positioned in the middle where he could capture the most votes. And he took a pragmatic approach to critical issues. So when you mentioned the environment as an example, yeah. He moved on environmental issues, well before many people had really introduced them as a hot topic. He recruited Lucien Bouchard into public life, made him environment minister, one of his most trusted advisors at the time, one of his oldest friends, and then he became one of his most senior advisors and ministers. And of course, Mulroney exerted his personal charm, his personal diplomatic skill in working with Ronald Reagan to achieve the Acid Rain Treaty, which Reagan was not necessarily, certainly Reagan's administration was not inclined to do so. And it's yet another example of how Mulroney saw the moment when a personal intervention on his part could turn things. And he turned Ronald Reagan. And as a consequence, Reagan instructed his own administration to move forward with the Acid Rain Treaty. That was all Brian Mulroney, just the charm, the wit, the smarts, and the skill of the man.
We're just watching different people talking to Mila Mulroney, Caroline Mulroney, and some of Brian Mulroney's sons as well, including Ben. The fact that we saw Erin O'Toole and other conservatives there as well, talking a number of times in the past couple of days, Scott, about how Brian Mulroney would reach out to them and give them advice as they tried to steer, the party through what were very choppy waters, certainly for Erin O'Toole and Andrew Scheer and others, and sort of his willingness to be there for them as kind of an elder statesman and sort of a counselor, a mentor of sorts.
Well, who better to learn politics from? Who better to seek political counsel from than a guy who won the largest political majority in history? A guy who was able to take premiers from Western Canada, knit them together with what was then called the Big Blue Machine of the Ontario Conservatives, the Queen's Park Conservatives, and strike an effective bargain with the Péquiste machine in Quebec under René Lévesque. Put all of those things together and build a nationwide coalition, a new coalition for what was then the Progressive Conservative Party, and win the largest number of seats in Canadian political history. So, yeah, I would think that if I was newly installed leading a political party, a conservative, liberal, new Democrat, orange, green, pink polka dot, he'd be the first guy I'd want to talk to because he knew a little bit about how to put these things together and to make the engine purr.
We have talked in the past, Scott, and we will be continuing to talk throughout the week about how Brian Mulroney believed in big things, big ideas, big projects. Do you think we will see that sort of thing again from a Canadian Prime Minister? And I don't want to cast aspersions on any current or former Prime Ministers that came after Brian Mulroney, but, that sort of, nation building that we saw from Brian Mulroney?
Well, I think it's a really important point. I mean, you can talk about the legacy of a large number of our prime ministers, and that indisputably his has permanence. Like his biggest accomplishments didn't get wiped away by whoever followed in his footsteps. It wasn't a temporary political achievement. You think about reforming the tax system. You think about constitutional change. You think about free trade with the United States. These are big, fundamental structural changes that by definition are sustaining and permanent. So that's the kind of record he built. And what did it require? It required risk. So if your question is, will we see those kinds of things? Do we see those kinds of political leaders? We see political leaders take risks these days. And we see political leaders aspire to make fundamental and structural change. We do. But I got to tell you, and I'll reach back into my own personal experience as a political advisor, almost everything about modern day politics is built around the notion of risk management. It's really permeated the practice and the approach to politics. Make certain that you don't take too big a risk, that you are always serving your own political base. Then try to inch out and gain some favor with the small number of people who might be persuaded to incrementally come to your side. What is the net effect of that? The net effect of that is incrementalism. It is a caution. It baked into our modern politics, this notion of risk management, surrounded by advisors who say, well, let's not take too big a cut. Let's not build expectations lest we fall short. Again, I'll go back to it. Tax reform, NAFTA. You take a look at constitutional change, and yes, Meach failed, and yes, Charlottetown was voted down. But these were big risks that he took, and he was willing to take them, and he knew that they would extract political pain. But as his favorite saying is always gets repeated, right? There's no point in harboring and holding on to your political capital. It is there to be spent, and he spent political capital by taking risks in a way that is not as common these days.
Yeah, we're just looking at Catherine McKenna, as you know, former Liberal Environment Minister, and I believe David Lametti, former Justice Minister in the Trudeau government, is there as well, talking to Mulroney's children. One other question I've got for you is, and you just touched on it a moment ago, but to a certain extent, this notion of I'm going to take risks and I'm not going to be popular. Some people are not going to like it, but it's what's good for Canada. And so it's not about trying to be up in the political polls. It's not about focus grouping everything and figuring this out. It's just like, look, we need to bring in the GST. I know it's going to make me very unpopular. I mean, Scott, I remember, those stickers that were around in the 80s, hi, I tax books for him. Yes. And his, Michael Wilson, his finance minister at the time. They took a real hit for stuff like that. And of course, yeah, the idea of trying to bring Quebec in, it blew up in their face to a certain extent and led to the creation of the Bloc Québécois, which we still have to this day. But that it wasn't always about what's the right thing to do versus what's the popular thing to do. It was sort of like, look, we're going to do the right thing.
Well, I would say this. All prime ministers convince themselves, absolutely fundamentally convince themselves, that their decisions aren't just in their political interest, but they're in the public interest of the country. So that is not uncommon. What is uncommon is to be able to take decisions that were unpopular, that held such fundamental political risk, such core political risk, like the GST. I mean, we're seeing right now with the carbon tax, the risks that come with fiddling with the tax system and imposing taxes on people. You see how difficult that is. What was unusual about Mulroney was that he was not only willing to take those risks, but he combined with it a political skill and a set of political talents where he could pull it off. Now, again, he didn't bat 1,000, but he had a pretty good record at the plate. He won the largest majority in Canadian history. He won re-election. He battled it out over free trade. He introduced the GST. He took not one but two cuts of constitutional change. And by the way, for those who say, well, he failed on constitutional change, the signature initiative there was to have Quebec recognized as a distinct society within the family of Canada. And that is now orthodox. That is now a recognized thing. The House of Commons passed a resolution, every member of every party agreeing that Quebec should be so seen. And so I would say that in the end, even there, where he paid a political price and he bore some political scars, the correctness of his course was demonstrated.
Scott Reid, CTV News political commentator, helping us quarterback our coverage today and will be throughout the week, including on the weekend as well. Good to see you, Scott. Much appreciated.